loss and grief and pain and joy and intimacy and a good future, all of that. Yeah, we're talking about all of that today. This is going to be a very special program. I'm Dr. Carol, and thank you for joining me in this particular episode. My guest today has a story that incorporates all of those things. Rachel Faulkner Brown has lived through losing, well, I'm going to let her tell you the story, but we get into the experience of loss and grief and the multiple cycles of that, and in particular, the matters of the heart about how that impacts our ability to connect, what it meant for Rachel, my guest, to learn intimacy, how intimacy with God and then intimacy in love and marriage and relationships, how all of those things are connected. Yes, they are. And you will really appreciate hearing just the movements in Rachel's heart about how all these things came to be. Rachel Faulkner Brown loves ministering to women. She's married, she has 2 children. Her ministries, Be Still Ministries and NeverAloneWidows.com. Lot to unpack in that story. Do stay till the end of this particular program. The resources that you can find at Be Still Ministries and Never Alone Widows will give you a discount code if you want to take advantage of any of those resources. But here is Rachel Faulkner Brown. Rachel Faulkner Brown, how great to meet you. Welcome to the program. I feel like you're a new sister that I'm just meeting.
I know, Dr. Carol, it's so awesome. This is such a treat. I love like-minded people. So this is like people that help the broken. That's our world.
Yes. And that is such a big part of your heart and life and ministry and work. You and I share something that I don't think it's a club we would have ever chosen to be, but you kind of have a double dose of this. I was first intrigued by your story of loss, and I'd like to start with that.
Yeah, totally. I know it's so funny when I'm meeting new people and they don't know me. In fact, yesterday I was getting my hair cut. She didn't know she didn't know anything about me, and her dad had died. I was like, oh my gosh, like the loss, I totally get it. So yeah, for me, my journey with loss started when I was 23 years old. I married my college sweetheart. We dated all through college, had a beautiful life. So we were together almost 8 years. And at 23 years old, 5 days after September 11th, he went to play a game of pickup basketball. And I got a phone call during the middle of the game that he had fallen and broken his ankle, twisted his ankle. It was communicated to me that it was just something simple. Yeah. But I go tearing over there, of course, to take him to the ER, the urgent care, whatever I was going to do. And when I get there, our doctor friend was doing CPR on him, and he had basically what we think is he'd had an aneurysm, fell on the concrete and severed his spinal cord, and it stopped his heart immediately. He was 27 years old, the picture of health, had run 5 miles the day before. And, here we are just like, wait, what? I was, newly married, basically 3.5 years. We'd had our, luncheon that day. We'd had barbecue, and we're talking about like having children and what grandparents, how excited they would be. And I mean, it would, all of that just came crashing down. And I was widowed at 23 and couldn't imagine that was my story, would have been my story. But honestly, I learned to, worship in those days, Dr. Carol. I didn't know. I was always a singer. I was always like loved singing in the choir and doing all those things, but I learned to worship after Todd passed away. And there is a big difference in singing and worshiping. And I and we know that, but I do think like when you go through dark times, and even today, I tell widows, I'm like, if you can just put on a song, it will take you out of your soul and into your spirit, because we are a 3-part being. And I do feel like music, I love to create environments, and music is one of the ways that I do that, because I just feel like for me, listening to Fernando Ortega's Give Me Jesus in my bedroom alone, widowed, 23, broken. I turned 24 10 days later. And I mean, it was just one of those moments where it was just me and him, and I didn't have anything else. I had a dog, and I have a dog, but I'm not a dog person. And so that did not bring me the kind of comfort that it would for some people. And but Jesus did, and worshiping did.
Yeah. Oh,
And
Rachel, I just got to comment on that for a second.
yeah,
One of the things I learned in my grief journey is there is no human being, as much as they love and care for you, who can show up at 2 in the morning when you're lying in bed alone and there's nobody there, and
no,
you're just the waves come over you and you feel
yeah.
like you're going to drown. Jesus, Jesus is the one who can show up then.
Oh, he's the one. Oh, yeah. Well, and one of my big things that we do, in my current ministry, is we invite Jesus into those hard places, because the reason, and I'm preaching to the choir here, the reason it's called trauma is because you believed you were alone. And so if you can take out that belief that you are alone, and if you can see Jesus with your mind's eye,
So
and
good.
you can sit in that hard place. I can sit on my floor and have my dog and visualize, like we can all see the Wizard of Oz. I don't have to show you, the Metro Golden Mare movie for you to see it. And Jesus, every time he went and did things, he said, I only do what I see my father doing. He didn't say what I hear my father saying. He said, what I see my father doing, that's what I do. And I believe that Jesus would literally see his day. He would see himself walking through the day, and God would show him, you're going to heal here, there. You're going to do fish here. You're going to touch this person. I thought he saw it every day. And so I think for me, teaching people and going back and doing this myself, it's literally changed my grief journey, because I went back to those hard places, and where I felt alone. And I said, show me where you are. It's that simple, Dr. Carol. I mean, it really is. It's that simple. It's closing your eyes and saying, show me where you were in this moment where I felt totally alone, and there's no way you could have been there. And he was there. He was there every time. He saw it all. He's never left you. He's never forsaken you. And that's what we want to believe. We want to make this make sense. Well, you left and then this bad thing happened. No, 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 no. He was there. So
Right.
God allowed me to, marry again. 2 years later, I ended up, I dated, after Todd passed away, I dated a year later, and then married a family friend. I mean, he was supposed to be an usher in our wedding. My in-laws and his parents were best friends. I mean, we were interwoven. But
Mm.
yet he was 10 years older. And so he was off, like, living the Air Force life and in Europe, and, bringing home rugs. He was like my rug dealer from Turkey.
Wow.
It was kind of hilarious. Like, because he would go on the KC 135 out of Birmingham, and he would, bring back goods from Turkey. And one of those were rugs, and we would all buy them from him.
Yeah.
Anyway, it was a beautiful, perfect, like only God could have put this together kind of deal. And we dated. It was pretty quick that second time around. And he was a fighter pilot in the Air Force. We were married for 5 years, two beautiful children, and he went to fly on a day like it is here in Atlanta. It was, gorgeous, beautiful blue sky, bluebird day. And he and a student pilot went to fly. They were taking off, and the cable in the wing, there's what they call an aileron, and that had a fissure in it. And so the flap on the airplane did not work, which meant that they had no lift, which meant that they immediately crashed with a full tank of gas as they took off. And so I was at home with a 5-month-old and a 2-year-old little boy, Blair, and Matthew took off. Blair told Matthew to eject. The ejection seat does not work below 1,000 feet. And so they both ejected, but it was kind of like the Top Gun moment where they hit the top of the canopy, and there was, they had both ended up with traumatic brain injuries and were killed instantly. And I was left again. And honestly, this time there was no doubt it was totally different. I had done this before, and I told Colonel Gerber
Yeah.
when he told me that Blair passed away, I told the wing commander, I said, I knew why you were here. I've done this before. And yet I had never done it with children. And there is
Mm.
such a difference, which is why in our current ministry, we do, retreats, 4-day retreats for widows. And it's the people who need the most help in the widow space, I would say, are the ones like my younger self who had babies and toddlers, and you can barely survive the day
Yes.
with a husband. And then omit a husband and you are left alone to solo parent. It's not like, single parenting where there's another husband involved. And that really doesn't matter. But I just believe because there are so many widows, I want to help the people that I know need the
Yep.
most help in that
Yep.
season. Because when I was widowed after Todd passed away, I kind of just went on with life. I mean, Todd wasn't there, but I went to work and I could still work out. I could do a lot of things. Whereas when you're widowed with little kids, like everything, just the color just gets kind of sucked out of your life, and there are just so many hard things and things to keep up with that most women are just so not prepared to do. And so God was just I think I was on some level I was prepared, but I could have never been prepared to do this with children. But I had an experience with the Lord, honestly, that changed everything. And about 7 days after Blair passed away, I was in my room. I was journaling the details of like his death and how it all went down, because I knew I was like, I'm going to forget this if I don't write all this down. And my friends had left, the crowds had gone, the
Yep.
funerals were over, that.
Yep.
Everybody's back to their worlds, and you're left to pick up all the shattered glass that's sitting around you. And I was doing that late. The kids had gone to bed. And granted, I have a 5-month-old and a 2-year-old. So that was a miracle. Everybody was in the bed. And I'm journaling, and I just experienced this just overwhelming, the manifest presence of God. There's no other way to describe it. It really, I don't even have human words to describe what it felt like. It was warm, it was safe, it was terrifying, it was powerful. I just knew he was with me. I knew he was in the room, and I said, I know you are here. And it was that simple. It wasn't crying. It was just his presence. I knew his
Yes.
presence was with me. And honestly, I will tell you, I think that night eradicated fear from my life, because I could have lived paralyzed for the next 50 years of my life easily.
Yes.
100%. I could have easily never driven, never flown, never let my kids out of my sight, wrapped them in bubble wrap, which I still want to do that some days. And yet at the same time, that night eradicated fear to be alone, fear to stay in my house alone, fear over my kids' future. Because I think he knew that I think there's just a destiny on all of our lives, no matter if you went through divorce, death, trauma, abuse. There is a destiny
Yep.
on your life for that
Yep.
pain. And I think my destiny didn't involve fear. And he knew, I'm going to call you to do things that you will not be able to do unless I allow you to have this experience with me. And I had no framework for it. I grew up where that just was, nobody talked about the manifest presence. I don't know that anybody ever had an experience with the manifest presence. Nobody talked about the gifts. I mean, it was like I was a lone ranger in this moment. And then God had called me out about 6 months before Blair died and just basically said, kind of, I want to marry you. And I was like, oh, okay. Like, basically, I want this intimate relationship with you that you are currently not experiencing. And so for me, that meant go get a mentor, because I was wrecked by it. Like, I was like, you're calling me into something bigger, and I don't know who to go get help
Yeah.
to do that. Like, I know this relationship that you want for me, but I just don't have a lot of people to go to. And I called one friend. So between that experience 6 months before Blair died and the manifest presence experience, um I was all in. I mean, there was no convincing me that there wasn't massive purpose behind this, because
Yeah.
I honestly, Dr. Carroll, I mean, when you go through that and when you go through loss, you have to believe there's something better.
Yeah.
You're like,
Yeah.
you gotta, and I knew it was like something better, but it was plus. Like, this is like so exponential nightmare situation, but yet you're so good. So there's gotta be good. And, Genesis 50:20, I didn't know it then, but it says, what the enemy intended for harm, obviously that was Joseph's brothers. But for me, it's a very real enemy who's after my family. He comes to steal, kill, and destroy everything good in your life.
Oh,
And and
yes, he does. And sorry, I gotta just ask you about something there. I love how
yeah,
you talked about the manifest presence of God, because that is where things change. When
yeah,
Jesus showed up on earth, his presence changed things. When
everything.
he shows up for us, things change. I
Yeah.
love that. What would you say to somebody who is experiencing pain of some kind, whether it's the death of a loved one or some other kind of pain or trauma, and they feel like, I would love God to do that for me. Why isn't he showing up for me?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the question why will literally kill you. And
Yep.
so that would be the first thing that I would say is stop asking that question. You will never, ever have that question answered. So if you could just eradicate the word why from your vocabulary, because it is futile, it is worthless, it will lead you down a path of doubt, and
Mm.
it will lead, and the enemy will attach to that doubt and make you believe, just like he did Adam and Eve, that he does not have your best interest at hand, that he's trying to hurt you, and all of that are lies from the pit of hell. And so this is what I tell every widow that I meet and anyone in the heart. I'm like, if you can start asking the question, who is on the other side of my pain,
Mm.
change your life.
Change
Because
it from why to who.
who? Yes. I mean, it is one letter. If you could just change that one letter from a Y to an O, who is on the other side of this pain? And I always talk about Mark 5 because I look at how terrified they were. Jesus was, he knew that there was a demoniac on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And so they sail over, he releases freedom into the demoniac, and that that demoniac went and saved 10 cities. And I think back, if the disciples had asked the question, and they did, why are you doing this to us? Or you're going to kill us, asking all these why questions. But Jesus knew there was a who on the other side. And so I say to anyone listening, there is a who on the other side of the storm.
Mm.
And if you can start asking God, show me the who today, just show me the who today in the next hour, a text that you can send. Because there's always somebody who needs our encouragement,
Yeah.
who needs what we have, even if we feel like we have nothing. And so
Good.
that to me, the why question is just such a waste of your time.
Oh, well,
Mhm.
that's a response from somebody who's been there. And you've
Yeah,
walked this journey, and I think that's what makes your story so powerful.
yeah,
So thank you for that, because
yeah,
this doesn't come from just Bible reading, although you've read the Bible, but it's not that that isn't important, but this came from
yeah,
you lived it. So that
yeah.
that
I
that just means
did.
so much. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think if I had continued to ask, why did I lose two husbands? I never would have a ministry. I would not be able to raise my children and say to them, pain is your superpower. I wouldn't have that perspective, because anyone listening, pain is your superpower. It is. It
That's good.
is what fuels the kingdom. It is. And you can, I truly believe, as weirdo as that sounds, I just truly think that, think about your life and where you've learned. You haven't learned in the good times.
Right.
Like, you haven't learned, on like, the best day ever. What did you learn in that? Okay, this is glorious. This is amazing. You learned in the hard. We all did. We
Right.
all learned in the failure. We all have learned. And so I tell my kids, like, your pain will fuel a beautiful life if you choose to let it. It's
That's
a
good.
choice. It
That's
is a
good.
choice for
Yeah.
all of us. I mean, we can And I mean, I love Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. It says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding, because your understanding is so broken and
Mm,
so small.
mm,
I think that's the thing for me, is that when you get a glimpse of the kingdom, and I've seen it, you've seen it, Dr. Carol,
yeah.
if you are a kingdom person who can see that this realm is just such a tiny little
Hmm.
glimpse of what's really going on. Like, I know people are like, oh, you can't see the back of the tapestry. It's so much bigger than a tapestry.
Yeah.
Like, that's like a short sale, for how really big the kingdom is and your role in it.
That is
Because
good. That is so good.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's really big. And I think people think, oh, I'm just one person and blah, blah, blah. You sell yourself so short. I
Mm,
mean, look at what Jesus did. Look at what 12 people who
that's right.
believed so radically in something. And
That's
we're
right.
still talking about them. I'm like, oh my gosh, 2,000 years later, I really want people to still talk about how the impact that I made in the kingdom. I mean, like, isn't that what this is about? I mean, if we're still here and Jesus hadn't come back, which I hope he has.
Yes, I know. I know. Well, talking about your story, that wasn't the end.
No.
I can imagine, in part because of my great grief journey, I was at a much older season of life than you. But after that, I can imagine some of the questions that your heart might have to wonder is it worth it to love?
Oh, yeah.
Is somebody who comes close to me going to die? You talked about God eradicating the fear, and what a beautiful
Mhm.
gift.
Mhm.
But I'd love to hear some about the movements in your own heart in thinking about, um, yeah, I lost two husbands, but I'm not giving up on love. I'm not giving up on intimacy. My
Right.
heart wants that, needs that, and it's okay, even though I've been so hurt there. Talk about what
Mhm.
that was like in your heart.
Yeah. Well, I'm not probably the best person to ask this, because I literally like love marriage, like so hardcore, hardcore love marriage. I mean, I was dead set. I knew I would get married again. I knew I wanted to love again. But what I didn't know is I didn't know how emotionally bankrupt I was,
Right.
and how emotionally bankrupt I was in both of my marriages. I always
Oh,
loved love, like that was so fun. And I loved like the trips and the companionship and all that, but intimacy was very elusive to me. And not just having sex. It's so much bigger than that, as we all
thank
know.
you. Yeah, we
Yeah.
have confused sex and intimacy so much, and I'm glad you
Yeah.
said that.
Oh yeah, yeah. And I'm not really a sex person. I mean, I love it and I think it's great, but I do think there is um there are some people that have bigger drives, but what I'm after is intimacy, and it's so beyond the bedroom. It
Yeah.
is so it starts way before, and it starts with healing of your own heart.
Mhm.
And to be honest, like, I'm just so thankful that I saw what healing looked like, because I don't honestly think I'd ever seen a whole person. I
Oh,
saw very uh religious people. That's what I
yes.
saw. I saw very religious people who were like hiding all their stuff. And I grew up in a family of depression babies being raising children who were my parents, who just like, let's just like not talk about hard things, because it's just hard enough to get food on the table. So let's just like, can we just forget all that happened? Which does not create a very healthy environment, to be honest, um and intimacy, even with your own family. And so I really had not seen that lived out. And then friends, just kind of doing the rat wheel of religion, and let's just go to church and do a Bible study and make it all better. And I wasn't seeing people walking in freedom from their shame. Everybody had shame. We were just all trying to put lipstick on our pigs. You know what I mean?
Yes, yes.
And then I moved to Huntsville, and I saw people like sharing like the worst thing that they'd ever done, like as a testimony. And I'm like, hold up, like, I'll talk about my husband's dying, but I'm not going to tell you like what happened in that closet in the back of my house, 25 years ago. Like,
Wow.
nobody needs to know that.
Wow.
But they did need to know that,
Yeah.
because it was locking you, actually me, in shame. And I didn't know anybody who didn't walk around with shame. So when you see it and when you see freedom, you're like, okay, not that is not happening in my life. So how do I get that? Because it's intoxicating. If you see a free person, you're like, what are you doing? What kind of face cream are you using? Because they're brighter, they're happier, they're full of joy. And I was a joy-filled person. I never woken up a day with depression in my life. Even after losing two husbands, I had joy, but I did not have freedom. And there is a very big difference. And
What do you mean, Rachel, by emotionally bankrupt?
well, I
You
didn't
use
know
that
how to,
phrase.
yeah,
Yeah.
I didn't know how to have an emotion. Like my counselor, I sat down after 11 years bearing two husbands. I sat down with her and she said, if Jesus were looking over the balcony of heaven, what would he feel about you? And I'm like, feel?
Feel?
What? I don't know.
What's
I
that?
mean,
Yeah.
do you have a list of words? That's literally what I said. I'm like a counselor's worst nightmare. Like, can you like hand me a card with a lot of words on it? Because I was like, and I said, I think you'd be disappointed because that was the gospel. The gospel that I knew was was Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John plus Rachel and what Rachel could do for Jesus to help him. He
Wow.
didn't need my help. He did it all on the cross, but I didn't know what the cross meant. And you're talking, I'm 35 years old and have been in church my whole life.
Yep.
So remind you this, okay? I was like born into the nursery, but I'd never heard the gospel because the gospel
Mm.
has actually nothing to do with you. You just get to believe it. It is all about what he did for me. It
Yeah.
isn't what you do for him. And I did not know that because in my head, I was like helping this thing along. I mean, like I was an integral part of the gospel. And hear me, we are. And yet at the same time, like it was up to me to make the gospel work, in my own life.
Yeah.
It was up to me to keep my sin slate clean. It was up to me to pray enough. It was up to me to serve enough that, I don't know, God was like marking off some box in heaven, like at VBS or something.
Yeah.
And so at the end of the day, when you've stuffed your emotions from the time you were a little girl and then you lose two husbands and you become a professional stuffer, obviously it was like one of those pop-up boxes where you roll the thing and then the clown pops out and has every emotion known to man. That's kind of what happened. It was like I had to relearn how to have valid emotions and to have somebody help me validate those because
Wow.
they just always felt unimportant. Like those are just unimportant to the mission. And so it took a lot of sitting on her couch for 2 years just to relearn and then to let go of the secret that I'd carried for 25 years because
Wow.
that will lock you in shame. I was, abused by a distant family member and it was child's play, Dr. Carol. It seemed like child's play, but it was anything but child's play to a super Christian who needed to like have the world think that you are perfect.
Yep.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
And so, and ministering to women even today, like, I mean, things that happen in, the next door neighbor's closet will lock a woman up for 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
And she's never told anybody. I mean, in fact, I was on a plane even not long ago, and this girl is just, I don't know. I guess I just have this message on my forehead, tell me your secrets. And she's telling me something she's never told anyone. And that's intimacy.
Wow.
Intimacy is into me, see.
Wow.
Let me see all of you. And I'm still learning. You don't just go to a counselor and all of a sudden the switch flips and you get intimacy. So I'm still digging out from 35 years of not experiencing that. And yet at the same time, like it's so much easier to receive the love of God when you just come and say, you already knew, you already
Yeah.
know. And
Yeah.
oh, by the way, let's have an experience together where I actually get to see this invisible God in my mind's eye, like I talked about earlier. And I get to sit down with him on a beach or a mountain or at the lake, which is my happy place with the Lord. And I get to sit down and just talk and chat and hear him laugh. And I mean, when The Chosen came out, I was like, that's exactly how I see Jesus.
You're talking about intimacy with Jesus. I want to get real explicit about that because I
Yeah.
think a lot of people, and we're talking probably to mostly women today, although not
Yep.
only, but women want a husband who sees them and gets them, and yes, that's what God intended. That's good, but you're talking about something of intimacy with Jesus at a level that I'm not sure a lot of people really believe is possible.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's so true because trying to interact with an invisible God, like
Yeah.
if you've never been taught that you have, eyes to see, ears to hear God, feelings, they're from God, and knowing you have this intuition. We like pass that off as intuition. I'm like, no, that is
Yeah.
straight from the Lord. I mean, He gave you that sense to be able to minister to people. And we have a Bible study called He Speaks, where we teach people, how to see pictures, how to, read scripture and hear words jump off the page. But I will say for me, Jim Wilder, and I don't know if you're familiar with
I
that name.
do, yes.
Yeah. So I love Jim. We do a lot of inner healing in our ministry with widows and women. And Jim is just he's amazing, and he does the Emmanuel approach, which is basically you use all five senses and you go to the most beautiful memory you've had in the last 6 months. So that doesn't involve loss. That's a big one for us. Like just a memory you've had in the last 24 hours that was just a beautiful thing you want to remember, and then you go through, what did you hear, what did you see, what did you feel, what did you taste, and you're in it, you are trying to experience, you using all of the faculties of your senses, your imagination, and then you invite the King of Kings into the picture.
Yep.
And I mean, that's intimacy.
Yeah.
That is intimacy. Can we sit down, and then, for me, I just start giving him things. I don't want to hold this anymore. Can I give you this? Like, will you take this? And
Mhm.
then he shows me what he does with it, which sometimes it disappears, sometimes he'll throw it into the water, sometimes it'll burn up, we just have the what we call them as activation. So our Bible study is called Father's House, and in that it's a multiplication study. So it's like basically you do it and then you do it over, and then you invite your friends and then they do it, and in those, after each week there is an activation, and it's basically this Emmanuel experience with Jesus where most people have never experienced in that way. And I don't know how people have intimacy without using their divine imagination. It's
Yes.
impossible. I mean,
Yes.
that's why we have a weak church, because they don't know how to create, and you have a lack of encounters with God too. I mean, I think when you start encountering God in your imagination and you start hearing him more, it creates this a beautiful opportunity to encounter him, to have revelation, which leads to intimacy. I always like see it in like a circle. Encounter leads to revelation, leads to intimacy.
That's
And
good.
then you go back the other way, so it's just a circle for me. The
That's
encounter,
good.
during a worship song, for me, a lot of times it'll lead me to a scripture, which leads me to intimacy because I fall in love with what he wrote down and what he left for us. And I get excited, so it's just a circle
That's
dance.
that's so good. That's so
Yeah.
good. So, you did meet Mr. Right
I
number
did.
3.
I did. And he was a
Yes.
pastor.
So just maybe a little bit about that, and in particular, I'd love to hear how your journey of learning about intimacy and this kind of growth with Jesus impacted your building intimacy with Mr. Right number 3.
Yeah, right. It's so funny. I look back and it was 6 years that I was widowed, and I don't think it was 1 minute too early, to be honest, because obviously healing is such a journey, and it takes 64 days to rewire the brain to one new thought. So I'm just kind of like, wow, I had a lot of new thoughts that I needed. And honestly, Rod had been going through his own journey of healing for years and years of healing, father wounds and things that he'd experienced. He'd experienced the loss of his dad. tragically in a car accident, which was a big deal for me because I was just like, wow, he's known grief, he's known immediate loss. It was a big deal. And he was whole, if what I consider whole on earth. And that was the same for me. Like I was moving to a level of wholeness that I had never known. Obviously, I don't think we ever arrive, but I do believe that for anyone that's thinking about marriage or even intimacy at all, I think that become the person that you want to marry, because I do think for me, I was moving to a place of, well, I want to marry a free person. I don't want them to have secrets, and I don't want to marry two husbands and feel like they didn't. I don't want to marry another husband or be married to another husband who really doesn't know me. I mean, it's sad, but I think about Todd and Blair and I'm like, I'm going to introduce myself to them in heaven and be like, I'm sorry, you really did not know me in the way that was possible,
Wow.
And so I think the reality is that for anybody, experiencing intimacy with the Father is such a precursor to intimacy with people.
Mm.
And yet at the same time, he uses people to show us what it can be. You know what I mean? And so there's this beautiful dance. And I'd known intimacy with my friends, for years and years that I didn't have with my husbands, which is interesting. I would tell them things, but yet there was just this little layer of shame because my sin was sin nature.
Yeah.
And anytime there's sexual shame and anytime there's you are so many blocks to intimacy, and one of them for me is obviously promiscuity outside of marriage. And I had no idea that everyone that, and fortunately I was a virgin, but everyone that you have been with before, whoever you're going to marry or your current husband, like all those people, if you were intimate with them, they are attached to your soul.
Yeah.
And so there is an unhealthy, a lot of times, soul tie with those people that need to be broken and severed. And I'd never even heard the word soul tie. I didn't know what that meant. And so I think for me, it was just going through like all of those unhealthy soul ties. Not all of them were sexual. Some of them were just people that needed to be broken off. They weren't healthy for me. And so I think just kind of doing a cleanup report, honestly, Dr. Carol, of your life and going, gosh, where do I have triggers? Where do I go from 0 to 60? And because as my counselor said, where if you go from 0 to 60 on anything, there is a wound. And I didn't know that. I mean, I didn't know what I didn't know. And I think, you've got some trusted friends in your life. If you do, asking them, what is it like to be on the other side of me? Because you got to ask the hard questions. To get to intimacy, it requires work and it requires hard questions. Because you just don't, as I say, you're inside the jar. You cannot read your own label.
That's good. That's good.
And I asked some people to read my label, help me read my label, and what about this label is not going to serve me well, and what am I currently doing in this season that I cannot take into the next season? Are you drinking too much? Are you hiding pills? Are you doing things in secret that aren't going to serve you, and especially aren't going to serve a spouse?
Mm-hmm.
So I think you got to get intimate with yourself before
That's
you
good.
invite somebody else.
Yeah. Oh, I feel like there's just hours that we could unpack with all of that, Rachel. That is just so good.
There are.
Yeah, but I want to give you just a minute to talk about your ministry. We'll make sure that links are available under this video and in the show notes to the audio. But just tell people for a minute where they can find out more and connect with just the beautiful work that you do.
Yeah, so fun. So a year after, about 6 months after I married Rod here in Atlanta, I went to pray with a woman, and she said to me, I never had any kind of prayer like this. And she said, Rachel, she said, your life's been really hard. You're like a crocus coming up out of a winter snow. and you will declare the goodness of God before the nations. And I had like 2 friends in Atlanta, and I was like, that feels impossible, but I knew that it was true. And it was about 6 months later that I went and bought 50 chairs at IKEA and started slinging them around in my back of my minivan and letting women tell their stories, because you, whether you know it or not, whoever's listening, you have a very, very powerful story that needs to be told. And we just don't invite, for whatever reason, we think preaching is the end all be all. And I'm like, we need to be telling more stories like Jesus. I love Paul, but I need more Jesus. And I just love hearing people's stories. And so I resourced some friends with homes and let 2 women tell their stories. And we had a prayer team that prayed for women. And that was 9 years ago, May the 4th. That Be Still started, and we decided to do an outreach arm for widows, because that felt like a normal a normal place for me to like take and help. So that began in 2018. We started doing retreats, and we've helped over 3,000 widows, any age. We've had them from 23 to 83 come to our retreats and conferences, and it has been truly one of those like, how is this my life? Because you never set out to, like, as you're running a ministry, you never
Yeah.
set out to like do this. You know
Right.
what I'm saying? You're like, I
Yes.
just kind of wanted to do a little podcast, and I just wanted to do a little retreat with 20 women that I knew I could help. And that first retreat, it was 24 hours, and we did a dinner and did nails and had a massage, and then we sent them home with prophetic words. And five of those 20 started ministries
Wow.
when they went home. And I thought, wow, okay, I think this worked, but I think we need a little bit more time, because that was pretty rushed. So we lengthened it, and our next retreat, I think it'll be like our 14th retreat next week. We'll be down at the beach, and we take 20 women. It's pretty lavish, because we want them to experience a little taste of what their husband's experiencing. And they've been making every meal by themselves since their husband died, and we just want them to not have to think. We don't even let them choose what food they eat. We just serve it to them, and they love it. They love not having to make decisions, and give them beautiful gifts. And yeah, Never Alone Widows and Be Still Ministries. So that'll be linked in your show notes. But it is like, it truly, some days I wake up, I'm like, oh, how did it become this? You're just so shocked at what God does with our little bitty mustard seed and our little loaves and fish. It's just not little to him.
Oh, no, it's not. It's not.
Yeah.
Well, yours has certainly not stayed little, Rachel. And I just
Yeah.
um, thank you again so abundantly for just the generosity of your heart and your
Oh.
ministry. And I feel like you and I need to stay connected.
Yeah. And you have to come to our conference.
That would be
You would
awesome.
love it.
That would really
You
be
would love
awesome.
it.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
many blessings to you. As you may have heard near the end of that conversation, AT&T kind of impacted our audio there just a couple times. But thank you for just being part of our family here online. And I would love you to check the links underneath this video. There we'll have links to Be Still Ministries and Never Alone Widows, and use the promo code if you buy like their Bible study resources or whatever, Dr. Carol 25. You'll see that also along with those links underneath this video, and take advantage. Rachel's been there. She's walked the journey of loss and grief and pain, and out of that, learning to love, learning to find joy, what the experience of intimacy with Jesus and then with others are. That's one of the things that is just so deep in my heart these days. And if you follow us regularly, I talk a lot about that these days. Intimacy with Jesus, intimacy with others, taking the walls down around your heart. That's different than sex. God intended it to be connected with sex in marriage, but whether or not you're married, you need intimacy. And I just love how Rachel put words to that from her own experience, and now how she's helping many other women experience that too. So check out those links. You'll also find links to a couple articles I've written about intimacy with others, and intimacy with Jesus. So check out those as well. And I would love to hear from you. You can use the contact page on our website, drcarolministries.com, to leave me a confidential message. I'd also love you to leave a comment under this video. I check every single one out, and I'd love to hear from you there as well. And now, until next time, may God bless you.